Thank you. Questions? Senator?
Yes, thank you. And I want to add on some of the questions because we're looking at quite a bit of curtailment there. Should nothing change in terms of the way we address public policy in the state with regards to energy. So that is an opportunity for quite a considerable amount of storage of energy. Should there be a plan to store energy, do you see any potential with the private sector or even the government sector, including encouraging the private sector to develop a concept for storing energy as a means to keep energy prices low in our state? We can store that. We can, use that as a means of providing energy to our state because that's quite a bit. That's a large amount we're looking at right now.
No question, and we already have a reasonable amount of storage in the state. Basically, what we've done in these cases is roughly double the amount of storage that we have today. We can utilize what we have more efficiently. As you say, we can develop that privately. We can develop that publicly. Some of the large bulk storages, I don't see that being developed privately. They're too large, and they affect the market too much. Simply by being there, they will essentially destroy the arbitrage in prices that you built it to take care of. In other words, if you have storage, you're saying I want to charge the storage or put the in storage when the prices are low and then give it back when the prices are high. Well, if you put a great big battery in there, then you destroy those price signals simply by being there. So I don't see the private sector and the market dealing with that. I think that is going to be a state's function or a utility-style function in order to do that. But I want to caution folks that storage is not free. First of all, it does cost something to build it. But secondly, there is losses by using that storage. So in effect, for most of the storage we use today, whether that's batteries or pump storage, you lose about 20% of the energy that you put into it by putting it in and then taking it back out. That 20% is really another sort of soft form of curtailment because whatever you're throwing that 20% away. So I think storage is not the first place to look. Storage is, I think you want to look first to the balanced portfolio. You want to look first to the imports and exports, which tend to be free, if you will. And then you begin to move into the storage. I think as you go past the 50 and 60%, then the storage becomes more and more important. But you also get into the thing where you're telling the customers or you're saying, we're going to reverse this. Right now, what we do is the load or people consume energy when they want to. And then we change the supply of energy to match what the customer demands when he wants to. Well, in the future, when we're talking about a 70, 80%, 90% renewable, it'll be the other way around. What we'll say is the customers will see the opportunity to consume some of that low-cost energy, let's say solar energy, in the middle of the day. And they will change their behavior to consume that energy. So we'll reverse the equation. Instead of load balancing a fixed demand, we'll have the supply being somewhat fixed or dependent upon the sun and the wind and everything else, and then the customers will tend to bid towards that demand. So, but that's way down the road. We can do a lot with the business model we have. We can do a lot with the technology we have. We just have to do it. We have to think, and we have to be flexible.
The reason I brought that up slightly is when you look at our transition to renewables, we're looking at laws that require the transition, and we look at subsidies. Not all electric generation is subsidized. When you look at geothermal, I can't think of a subsidy. I can't think of even a policy that has even helped geothermal gain footing. And in my discussions last year about geothermal, the different utilities came and said, well, we would consider more geothermal if we had more if geothermal had the ability to store their energy, because they operate 365 days a year, 12, pretty much
24/7.
24/7. And that would not help the imbalance in the grid, is what they said. But they said it would help if they were able to store. My response is, why don't we provide that requirement to every energy producer, right? Solar, wind, every renewable should have the ability to store. So wouldn't storage be a way of leveling the playing field for the producers?
I think we have to be careful with what we define as storage. I mean, that we can talk. We talk a lot about. We use a word like dispatch, and all dispatch means is that resource is capable of producing more at that time, but we choose not to, and that's a form of storage.
Let's talk about storage in terms of where you put the curtailment itself, putting that into storage, and
right.
Storage being whatever's produced during valleys in the production cycle, and or peaks where you have overproduction, where that you find a way to accommodate the storage of that, when in fact you have a situation where you can predict when that is going to happen.
Most of these situations are predictable. I mean, let's face it. I mean, we know where the sun's going to be tomorrow. We can guess very well what the output from the solar is going to be. And if, for example, we have a cloudy day and we say, well, on a cloudy day we don't know about tomorrow, then we don't have that problem of overgeneration by definition.
I think
so storage.
To summarize, is there a place in the way we legislate production in our state for storage? Is there a place?
Yes, there is, and I think the PUC has already recognized that with their decision, which talked about a mandated storage amount, and in the future there will be more of that. And I think I do not believe that, at least for the large bulk storage, that's going to be a private individual thing. I think that is going to be a collective effort. And by that I mean some utility rate-based effort. I don't, it's too much of a system need. It's not so much each individual resource. And I think again, what is rewarded in this event is prudence and diversity. And so, yes, there is a huge place for storage, but it is not the total answer. I had a friend who used to say there is no silver bullet, but there is silver buckshot. And I think that's what we're looking at.
You have heard of Tesla's developing
Yes, I have.
battery for personal use in your personal home. And that's what I mean for private sector, where, the state can partner up with the private sector there and encouraging that mode of storage through the private level, where people can almost, in some instances, disconnect from the grid through their home battery.
I don't, we can't ignore the fact that storage at the private level and what Tesla represents and the lithium-ion batteries are a significant advance from where we were. But I don't think we can say that significant advance has reached a tipping point where that's the answer and that's all we need to rely on. It's going to have a place. It's going to have a big place. We're going to be hearing a lot about it, but it doesn't mean that we don't have to work on all the rest of the stuff too. And that the more we rely on any one of these things, the more vulnerable we are to changes in events, to things. It is a matter of being patient, of being diverse, and of relying on a whole lot of little things. That's a much more reliable, cost-effective system than relying upon one thing or hanging our hat strictly on Tesla's batteries. But Tesla's batteries are a very interesting, very important thing going forward.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you again, Mr. Jim Caldwell. We have two more speakers on this panel. And I would ask if they would both come forward. Richard Corey, Executive Officer for the State of California Air Resources Board, and Verinder Singh, Director of the Regulatory and Legislative Affairs for EDF Renewables. And so we'll start with Mr. Richard Corey. Welcome, and You may begin.
Thank you, Chairman and members. It's a pleasure to be here today, and what I wanted to do was to start by discussing the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals and providing an overview of the policy framework in place to enable California to achieve these goals. Then I'll explain the role the Air Resources Board plays in meeting the state's greenhouse gas goals. And lastly, I'll conclude with the opportunities and challenges for California's energy sector to achieve cleaner air. First, the current plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. AB 32 requires California to cut its greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. In 2008, ARB adopted the initial scoping plan to lay out the state's strategy for achieving this objective. The plan reflects a comprehensive approach that the state is taking to cut emissions and drive the transition to a clean energy economy. Major elements of the initial scoping plan provide the foundation of California's climate program. They include the now statutorily required 33% renewable portfolio standard, cap and trade regulation, clean vehicle standards, energy efficiency standards and for buildings and appliances, and the low carbon fuel standard, and sustainable community planning pursuant to SB 375. The cap and trade regulation provides two elements that are needed to support the development of a clean energy economy: a hard and declining cap on emissions and a price on carbon. The hard and declining cap covers about 85% of the total statewide emissions in California, meaning that if even other policies underperform, regulated entities will nonetheless be required to take the necessary actions to reduce emissions sufficiently to meet the 2020 target. How they choose to comply is up to them, which significantly increases the cost effectiveness of the regulation. The other key element of the cap and trade regulation is the economy-wide economic incentive it creates for the development and deployment of clean energy technologies. An economy-wide price on carbon sends a clear, unambiguous signal that California is serious about powering the economy with clean, less carbon-intensive technologies, and that investment and development in them will be rewarded. All these rules and regulations are important, and many are designed to achieve not just climate goals, but other energy, economic, public health, and transportation-related goals. AB 32 requires ARB to update the scoping plan every 5 years. The first update to the scoping plan was adopted last year, and this first update highlights California's progress towards meeting the near-term 2020 greenhouse gas emission reduction goals defined in the initial scoping plan, and it also evaluates how to align the state's longer-term greenhouse gas reduction strategies with other state priorities, policy priorities for water, waste, natural resources, clean energy, transportation, and land use. And I'm pleased to report that we're on track to meet the 2020 target. Moving on to ARB's role in meeting California's greenhouse gas goals. ARB has undertaken over a dozen regulations targeting greenhouse gas reductions covering the majority of California's economy. California has become a clear leader with respect to climate policy and is embracing its leadership role as other states and subnational jurisdictions look to California as they develop climate programs of their own. For example, California and the Canadian province of Quebec have linked their respective cap and trade programs, resulting in more cost-effective emission reductions across multiple jurisdictions. Cap and trade programs are being explored or are already being developed in the Canadian province of Ontario and 7 regions in China. Low-carbon fuel standards are being explored or developed in Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, the European Union, and the United Kingdom. Finally, the cap and trade program has resulted in more than $2 billion in auction proceeds that are being reinvested in California to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and support the long-term transformative efforts needed to improve public and environmental health and develop a clean energy economy. ARB's program is not only reducing greenhouse gas emissions and advancing California's position as a clean energy leader, but they're also contributing to cleaner air and more sustainable communities for generations to come. I'd like to now turn to opportunities and challenges for California's energy sector in achieving cleaner air. The California energy sector has played a significant role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, including the investment in and development of renewable sources of energy. In 2006, SB 1368 created greenhouse gas performance standards for long-term financial investments in baseload electricity generation serving California customers. This policy ensures that power is generated from cleaner sources by effectively placing restrictions on utilities from building new carbon-intensive plants or entering into new contracts with high carbon sources of electricity. In 2008, the California Energy Commission estimated that 12% of the California retail electric load was met with renewable resources. Today, more than 20% of the power delivered by the major utilities is generated from qualifying renewable sources, and the majority, or rather major utilities, are on their way to meeting the 33% target by 2020, established by the Renewables Portfolio Standard. On this point, the Salton Sea Authority, with the support of the state, is seeking to develop a new geothermal facility capable of generating enough power to support over 1 million homes. This is a reliable source of energy that is not subject to weather or seasonal fluctuations. This project is an opportunity to help the state meet its climate change goals with minimum impacts to landscape and habitat. In addition, the area around the Salton Sea is well suited for new solar development. The siting of these new or types of projects on exposed sea lake bed can also help control dust emissions. Cost-effective and technologically feasible large-scale energy storage is also needed to maximize the benefits of variable renewable energy such as solar and wind power, as was discussed earlier. Effective energy storage would allow for quick dispatch of stored renewable power instead of ramping up natural gas power plants when the wind is not blowing or at night, thus reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Recent developments at the state and federal level reinforce a commitment to renewable energy. In his inaugural address, Governor Brown called for increasing the electricity derived from renewable sources to 50%. This past April, Governor Brown issued an executive order establishing the most ambitious greenhouse gas reduction target in North America, a 40% reduction below 1990 levels by 2030. At the same time, U.S. EPA is expected to issue its final rule for addressing greenhouse gas emissions from power plants, referred to as the Clean Power Plant Rule, this summer. ARB is currently spearheading an update to the scoping plan to chart the path to achieve the 40% midterm target. The plan will be developed in coordination with sister agencies and include opportunities for public engagement and feedback. It'll be considered by our board later in 2016. The plan will lay out how the state envisions meeting the state and federal requirements with existing and new policies. For the energy sector, it'll be important to support additional renewable energy sources within the state and effective energy storage. In closing, the state's climate program is paving the road to a low-carbon future. The development of renewable energy and a low-carbon grid are aligned with California's ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals and are complementary to ARB's objective of obtaining and maintaining healthy air quality for all Californians. So thank you, and I'd be happy to answer questions.
Thank you. We'll get into the next presenter and then open it up for any questions that might come from the committee members.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. Solomon Garcia and members of the committee. My name is Verinder Singh. I'm Director of Regulatory and Legislative Affairs for EDF Renewable Energy. We're a leading North American developer of renewable energy projects. We were born in California in the 1980s, and we were headquartered in San Diego with over 1,000 megawatts of wind and solar projects in operation or under construction in the state. And we serve just about every investor-owned utility and numerous municipal utilities, so we serve a lot of the ratepayers in this state. Preserving and restoring the Salton Sea will require long-term policies to address this unique problem, some of which are energy-related, some of which are not. On the energy side, we certainly see geothermal as being an important part of that puzzle. And I think as Jim elaborated on, which I'll talk about briefly, but without Jim's engineering credentials, geothermal works in an expanded market for clean energy, which involves a mix of flexible resources and complementary resources to make the overall package work in terms of rates and in terms of reliability and, of course, in terms of carbon for Californians. One thing I'd like to assure all folks is that on the developer side, the private sector side that actually gets the projects done, I will speak for my industry across all renewable technologies in saying that we are constantly innovating. We are well-versed in collaborating with the local community to make sure the local community benefits from our projects. And per broad discussions going on in the Capitol today, it is absolutely essential for us to make sure our products work for both our utility off-takers, the grid operator, and ultimately the people who finance our project. We get financed by numerous California banks, entities like Google and others. So we get financed by California entities. We need to perform on time. We have to deliver our amounts. We have to provide reliability. We have to provide the local payments to landowners and counties. And if we fail any of those, we wear the risk. There's nobody that we can go to get rate recovery and such. We wear the risk. So that forces us to be innovative, and every day we're working hard to make sure our projects work. One thing I do want to emphasize from what Jim talked about is how that renewables can be very much part of the reliability solution. Historically, renewables were pretty much seen as something you stuff onto the system so that you can check a box that requires you to buy a certain amount of renewables. We can't do that anymore. When we're talking about 50% renewables and above, which we can achieve, the renewables, in a sense, have to be a centerpiece of how the grid is operated. That's a change in thinking. We're starting to see that thinking change in places like Colorado, where they're seeing very high penetrations of renewables, and elsewhere. But I think, per Jim's point, you need flexibility between the ears, and that is starting to emerge now that renewables are seen as such a central part of the U.S. electric sector. In terms of price, we are competitive, if not cheaper, than new fossil fuel generation in many parts of the United States. And we all get subsidies, so in some ways. Fossil's gotten subsidies for over 100 years, but in general, we're doing our job in terms of cost reductions and in terms of performance improvements. We can provide reliability in terms of things such as automatic generation control. We can help with economic dispatch, and as Jim said, there's a little bit of curtailment that could be a part of that, but it needs to be managed. We can provide frequency control and voltage ride-through so that we don't actually make voltage problems even worse. We can actually make them better. These are based upon relatively new technologies, relatively new remote controls you can put on systems. So it's a mixture of software and hardware. But when you put it all together, it contributes to a resilient grid. I mentioned wind and solar, and that's what we've mainly done in California. But what wind and solar cannot provide beyond the reliability elements I just described is baseload generation capacity, and this is where geothermal comes in. Geothermal has consistently high capacity factors, which allows it to play the role traditionally dominated by coal-fired generation, certain gas-fired generation, and nuclear generation in the state, to play that baseload role. We've seen the closure of the San Onofre nuclear generation plant. I think there are questions about other nuclear generation in the state going forward. We see a robust future for further baseload generation in the form of geothermal. There was a question that Senator Hueso asked about storage. When I say EDF, renewable energy, EDF stands for Electricité de France. Some people think it's the Environmental Defense Fund, and I have to correct them once in a while on that. But EDF is one of the leading developers of pumped storage hydro projects around the world. Asia, throughout Asia and Europe, they've built tens of pumped storage projects. The reason Electricité de France did a lot of pumped storage was in France. France relies a lot on nuclear, as you may know. The baseload nuclear really benefits from a flexible resource on top of it that can flex because the baseload cannot flex as much. In the case of geothermal's important baseload role, having a flexible resource like storage on top of that creates a very nice complementary dynamic. And as Jim said, it's not just about one technology. So it's not just our pumps. We are developing a pump storage plant that can serve Oregon. That's about 400 megawatts. The pump storage today is not the same as pump storage yesterday. There are several pump storage plants in operation in California, but they're from a generation or two ago. We actually are able to deploy variable speed technology that is significantly more flexible than yesterday's technology that California is more familiar with. And the technology is highly financeable and proven. It's somewhat boring. Sometimes I think it's so boring that we don't get any attention paid to us compared to shinier, newer storage technology objects.
Any members in the committee to stick around, man.
But it really is, we can provide, to help with Senator Hueso's question, we can provide a centralized storage service that helps the entire system. There will be the Tesla batteries in some people's homes. That will help also. So it'll be a mix, but there are central storage services that can help the entire system. We've just finished a very intricate modeling process where we looked at the benefit of our project, if we get to build it, and how it benefits every major load-serving entity in the state amongst investor-owned utilities and municipal, going from north to south. Our project would benefit every load-serving utility in this state. There's a positive net benefit. The trick is there is such widespread benefits. To Jim's point, we need policy signals for the state to say this is important enough for the state to invest in. Because otherwise, so many different entities benefit in so many different ways that it's almost too widespread to rely on one entity doing the transaction for this project because it has very broad-based benefits. So there is a public policy role here. We are certainly very supportive of legislation that calls for 50% renewables. I think part of the message here is there are things that can be done around that to ensure that the state puts together portfolios that has reliability as a centerpiece so that the 50% is a part of a least cost, highly reliable, low carbon portfolio. It is achievable as long as the state can put the mechanism together to look at things as a whole, rather than the old system, which was some utilities saying, okay, we'll have to do renewables, we'll stuff these in, we're going to operate the system the way it's always been. That needs to change, and it can change. We got the technology. As Jim said, we have smart folks in this room and outside this room in this state who can figure it out if they're given the flexibility to figure it out. And we're a part of the solution, obviously, as developers, but it's within that whole context that geothermal can be a great part of a broad portfolio. There was a mention, finally, of carbon regulations by my colleague here. A lot of California's neighboring states are going to be facing some very stringent regulations coming from the United States Environmental Protection Agency as they finalize the rule over the next couple of months. Regardless of what you think of federal environmental regulation, if California moves down a high renewables path, including geothermal, we see robust export opportunities to other states. Your neighboring states that aren't doing as much renewables will need California's renewables to fulfill the requirements. So there's a tremendous opportunity with Arizona, Nevada, and other states in the West. So want to make sure that folks are aware of that opportunity. For once, California can talk about exporting its energy in a meaningful way rather than how do you bring stuff in from other states. The final thing I will say is we do also want to stress the importance of drawing upon some out-of-state resources. The focus should be on in-state development. But if you do what I call a strategic dollop of some out-of-state renewables, which are incredibly least cost, you can make sure the overall package is least cost enough that you can do rooftop solar, you can do the geothermal, you can do all those things inside California with incredibly cheap resources coming out from outside of California, not swamping overall demand, but in a very strategic manner. You can get some great wind resources from New Mexico, for example, to make sure the overall package makes sense, and you can do the great in-state stuff like geothermal that provides local economic and revenue benefits.
All right, thank you. Any questions, Mr. Dodd?
Yeah, it may be boring to you, but the pump storage, can you kind of give me a layman's description of what that works? And you said it's been around for a while. There's been several iterations. I'm not familiar with the older iterations, let alone the newer.
Well, I'll just tell you the basic setup is you have a reservoir at the bottom and you have a reservoir at the top, and you have a conveyance in between. You might see this stuff if you're driving on I-5 out of LA and Castaic. So what you get to do, it's like a battery. When you have too much power, say there's overgeneration, this system will suck up that power. It'll power the water to get pumped up to the upper reservoir. And when you need the power at a later time, you run that water down, you run turbines, and you generate that power. Sure.
All right, thank you. We have 4 more speakers. Thank you again, 3 of you who have served on this panel. I'm going to ask if Edward Randolph with the Energy Division Director for the Public Utilities Commission, Mr. Ron Oglesby, Executive Director for the Energy Commission, Karen Edson, Vice President of Policy and Client Services for CAISO, and Mr. Kim Kelly, if you please step forward. We'll try to limit the presentations to 5 minutes each and then get into the questions, answers, and then public comments. So, Mr. Edward Randolph, floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Like I said, I'm Edward Randolph, Director of the Energy Division of the California Public Utilities Commission. I've been asked to give an overview of the CPUC's role in approving renewable contracts, transmission planning, and the impact this planning could have on 50% renewable targets and on GHG reduction and reliability. Best place for me to start on this is to give a quick overview of our procurement review process for the renewable contracts. This is a multi-stage process that first starts with the utilities submitting on an annual basis a renewable procurement plan. The plan contains a number of details, including the utilities' current renewables need, terms they would have in their standard form contracts, the solicitation protocols they would use in the procurement process, and the methodology the utility would use for what's referred to as the least cost best fit valuation. After taking input from the stakeholders, the Commission approves the procurement plans through a vote of the full Commission. After the utilities have the approved procurement plans, they are able to issue, they generally issue what are referred to as requests for offers, RFOs, to generators. Generators submit the RFOs to utilities, and they will take those and take a valuation method and rank the RFOs based on valuation. They use that to create a short list. The short list is reviewed by what is referred to as the Procurement Review Group, which is a number of individuals and groups that are not stakeholders or not interested parties in the procurement process. This includes environmental groups, labor unions, consumer groups. They will consult on the short list, and then after that's done, the short list is submitted to the PUC for review and approval at the PUC. Once the PUC has approved the short list, the utilities then negotiate the individual contracts with the generators. The short list is typically much longer than the number of contracts the utilities ultimately execute. That's because as they negotiate contracts, some of the contracts will never be executed, will drop off for reasons of viability, price, other issues out there. Then once there is an approved or an executed contract between the utility and the generator that is submitted back to the PUC for approval by the PUC, that requires a full vote of the Commission for approval of each of the individual contracts. That's the basic overview of the process we go through on the contracts. I think the key issue that this committee and the legislature has been concerned about with this process is the issue of valuation, how the utilities actually rank and value the projects, and then we use that same valuation when we're analyzing the contracts to make sure they conform to the procurement plans. There seems to be some misconception going around that this methodology only looks at the cost of the project and not at other inputs such as transmission costs, integration costs, and reliability costs. You know, the fact is all of the utilities look at a number of factors beyond cost. This is in their procurement plans, and it's spelled out when they submit contracts for review. They use the valuation to develop what is referred to as the net market valuation. And like I said, they use that net market valuation to rank the projects. The net market valuation includes the actual cost of the energy, the cost of any new transmission needed to be built to bring that transmission to their load, the cost of any added congestion that the project could create, and the cost of integrating that resource into the overall grid. That's on the cost side. It also looks at the benefit side, which looks at the value of the energy that project will provide. It also looks at the value of the capacity that project provides to the grid, and the value of any congestion relief a project may provide to the grid on the benefit side. It also takes a look at some more qualitative factors such as project viability and on a very minor scale some of the environmental impacts a project could have, but that more feeds into the viability. You know, of course, the formulas are far from perfect. And as we've moved further and further into RPS procurement and moved to 20%, and we'll be moving to 33%, we know more and more about the integration cost, and we know we can do better and better in valuing these projects. To that end, the CPUC has several initiatives underway to get a better assessment of the valuation. The two key initiatives are, one, reforming or adding a better integration cost adder. And the integration cost adder would be adding to the project valuation what the cost of integrating that project into the grid. And that means what's the cost of the flexible resources that would be needed from elsewhere to match that resource when it's not available, or if it's an intermittent resource, to be able to balance that resource's ups and downs throughout the day. We officially adopted an interim integration cost adder at the beginning of this year to be used in future valuations. That's an interim, and that was based on proposals from parties and makes some estimates out there, and we want to get to harder numbers. So within open proceeding right now, we are looking at longer-term, better integration cost adders. The key phase of that to be done at the end of this year, consistent with AB 2363 from last year that required us to develop an integration cost adder. We're actually ahead of that bill by having adopted an interim at the beginning of the year. The other key reform out there is developing what's referred to as the expected load carrying capacity, or ELCC, into the valuation of renewable contracts. And in English, a short description of what the ELCC is it's a tool that will more accurately assess the impacts a specific resource has on grid reliability. So it gives it a better valuation in terms of its impact on what's referred to as capacity value, but that's the reliability. As I said, the one project, the integration adder, the key phase of that will be done by the end of this year. On the ELCC, we expect to have a staff proposal out late summer, probably more likely in the September stage for comments for parties on that. At the same time, we're looking at making these procurement changes. The goals of the renewable procurements are moving, and we are now planning for what needs to happen to reach 50% renewable goal, and more importantly, the 2030 greenhouse gas reduction goals. As Jim Caldwell study had shown, and other studies show, we need to do a better job coordinating all of the clean energy procurement activities to ensure reliability and cost effectiveness. If we follow the current procurement methods, we will likely have times in the year where there's tremendous overgeneration, and we'll also need a number of expensive resources that sit idle most of the time, but need to be ready to turn on quickly and turn off quickly as solar and wind power come on and offline. The changes in the renewable valuation I just discussed will certainly help meet these challenges by helping shape the most effective resource mix. Additionally, the PUC, the Cal ISO, and the CEC are already coordinating to identify the mix of energy efficiency, demand response, storage, procurement reform, and rate changes we need to effectively integrate renewable resources and get to the 2030 and 2050 greenhouse gas goals. Right now, renewable procurement in California has slowed down some, since utilities have largely procured what they need to get to 33% mandate, but we anticipate, logic only dictates that it will accelerate again once the 50% goal is established. With the procurement reforms I just discussed, I don't foresee that the portfolio mix in the future will be weighted so heavily towards wind and solar, since the integration cost of those resources will climb as they become a larger part of the portfolio. Renewable resources that help with overgeneration issues, provide more energy late in the day, or have flexible characteristics will provide more benefits and should have higher values. I think, as we discussed geothermal, in the past, geothermal's been in as a baseload resource that doesn't provide some of those tools. But from talking to a number of geothermal developers, they stand ready to offer newer technologies that can provide those benefits. And we have to think those would compete very well under the new valuations with that new technology. I haven't discussed the transmission planning, but in the interest of your 5-minute limit, and knowing that Ms. Edson's going to hit on most of the transmission issues, I'll forego on that now, but we'll be ready to answer questions after she's done.
All right. Good.